The smaller the intensity number, the more aggressive the cam. The higher the intensity number, the less aggressive the cam is. I guess we start the discussion with duration because, when you talk about 234, 238, or whatever the numbers are, it's like, I'm going to immediately ask you if it's 1 millimeter or if it's 50 thousandths, right? The 50 thousandth standard was actually a standard that Harvey created. Import guys also do by millimeters. I'll use dual annotations sometimes, millimeters, lift, it doesn't matter. 1 millimeter lifting checkpoint for most import Asian made cams or Japan cams. And then we have a 50 thousandths checking point for US based people, right? And then the question is advertised. A lot of times people will be comparing the advertised number to the 50 thousandths number and say, you could have one guy say, I got a 276 cam, another guy say, I got a 238 cam, and they would both be right, but they would be looking at different spots to get those numbers. And I think that's confusing because I can actually make a 276 cam at 50, which would be a very different proposition than a cam that's 276 advertised. I
Okay,
think
so pause for a minute and explain at 50.
at 50, so we don't. If you've ever looked at the indicator as it's just starting to move, it's very fine movement and it's hard to discern where zero is at, right? So they establish a checking height to use as just kind of as a barometer to know where to set things up, right? The 50 thousandths checking height is mainly just to set things up, if you ask me, because I think the actual number that we should be concerned about is when the valve actually opens and when the valve actually closes, right? Because when the valve closes, we're sealing pressure. When the valve opens, we're bleeding pressure.
Right, but you needed the 50 thousandths number to have a stable reading on the dial indicator that's looking at the valve movement.
Yeah, it's easy. It's very easy to figure out where it hits 50 because it's not like when you're coming off of zero, that needle's quivering and you don't know where it's at. So typically, like advertised duration, typically the checking point is going to be around 4 thousandths. Right? I've seen some people do a 6 thousandths check height because a zero, like a pure zero check height, would be hard to measure that accurately, and everybody's setups would be all over the place if they use zero as the setup point, right?
Okay.
All the magic happens here. Right. So we could have the same cams with the same 50 thousandths lift and the same 50 thousandths duration and the same lift, but we can make cams that behave differently based on how long this tail is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a great opportunity to drop in your valve motion diagram, because that circled area is where things are getting upset as you're putting the valve back on the seat.
Let's talk about aggressive cam. Everybody talks about what an aggressive cam is, right? So
I think the industry looks at the term aggressive as single-sided to lift. I don't think the industry definition of aggressive versus the technical aspects of an aggressive cam as it relates to valve motions and what's happening at the seat are two different things.
how do we
Right.
measure aggressive? What is aggressive?
I would say that the industry looks at aggressiveness, they strictly look at lift and duration as how aggressive a cam can be, mainly lift.
So aggressive, if I have, here's my 50 point. I can also have a lobe that's like this. So you're saying the aggressive is the same, they're just looking at lift, or they're looking at lift and duration?
Based on feedback I get from customers and just the industry. I would say they're just looking at
Lift and duration.
lift and duration. And
Okay.
let's just put two scenarios. Let's just say a 590 lift with 282 duration. I don't know if you want to write those down, Dave. We'll just compare. We'll just
What is it?
580 lift at 280 duration, right? Versus a 600 lift at, or we can go a little more aggressive. Let's just say a 610, a 620 at 270, 268.
Well, that's more aggressive for sure.
So yeah, but the industry would say because there's less duration, the 580 lift, 280 duration in terms of how the industry would look at it would be a more aggressive cam.
Okay, so let's look at what I drew here. Let's say this is a 250. Say this is a 230 cam. This is a 250 cam. And this is lift A, lift B. Realistically, like since the shape is essentially the same shape, just kind of scaled up, these cams are the same level of aggressiveness. Like if I design them with the same accelerations as we talked about last time, the graphs would look like this, but one would be no more aggressive than the other. It's just bigger.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? So it's like bigger is not more aggressive necessarily.
Right, valve motion is gonna kind of hold the keys on whether or not it's an aggressive cam or not, because you have different rates of acceleration, whether or not it's lofting, how it comes back kind of into the world as it seats the valve. That's where a lot of the aggressive lies.
And I think to make it easier, Dave, maybe you have a drawing where two cams actually have the same lift and one just has a dramatically shorter duration, and then maybe we can explain why the shorter duration becomes more aggressive.
I got to talk about something that's called intensity. You ever see that term with camshafts, Jay?
Yeah, there's high intensity cams. I think that was a Crane thing, wasn't it?
Right, but what is intensity?
I would suppose it is the velocity, how fast the valve goes into motion would have a tie to intensity.
So I'll give you the actual definition of intensities. Major intensity, and this, you're right. This is pure Harvey Crane. Anybody who talks this way either learned from the same people or read the same books. You know, I mean, so what is intensity? Intensity, major intensity is 50 thousandths duration. I'm going to let you just kind of think about that for a second. Did you see it yet? Why it's intensity? How quickly I'm going from 20 to 50.
Right.
Right?
Yeah,
How quickly I go
the
to
valve, when the valve goes into motion, how does it go into motion?
right? How quickly can I go from 50 to 20? That's the major intensity, because that little, where I said the ramp sets up everything else. So the shape of your ramp basically will set up and your lift. So the shape of your ramp and your lift will set up the overall aggressiveness or the intensity. So major intensity, why did he choose 20 thousandths? I suspect that's probably because your overhead valve stuff, that's a pretty kind of average lash setting.
In the old school, there was a lot of 2022.
Right. So I think he chose 50. 50 is the checking height. 20 is the lash height on the OHV engine. So he wants to see how quickly it goes from 20 to 50, and that sets up the rest of the profile, right?
Yeah.
So minor intensity is duration at 50 minus duration at 10. Why 10? I actually think it's probably because some of the modern engines only grow about 8 to 10, 7 to 10, 7 to 14, right? So if major intensity would give us a good idea of what's going on with the cam, the minor intensity would give us even more of a better idea of how quickly it's going to go from 50 to the seat. But you can say how aggressive is measured by how many degrees it takes to go from the seat, which is going to be your 20 thousandths lash point approximately, to your 50 thousandths checking point. Does it make sense?
Yep.
And then minor intensity, it's like, our engines are probably closer to the 10 thousandths. I've never lashed a modern engine at 20 thousandths, right? So the minor intensity also gives me a reference of how quickly it's changing from 10 to 50. I can have a small major intensity and still have a large minor intensity.
Say that again.
I can have a short major intensity, and then anything below 50, I can make it real lazy and go to the seat real slowly, and then have a really big 20 thousandths or 10 thousandths duration. So I could have a very big minor intensity and a very low major intensity. It's reverse. The smaller the intensity number, the more aggressive the cam. The higher the intensity number, the less aggressive the cam is.
Right, because your valve motion over degrees.
Yeah, we're just kind of taking like, I know it's a curve, but we're just kind of looking at an A to B with a rate, right? So the
You have
rate,
Spintron examples of different valve intensities and how it affects, how the
see,
machine
the
sees that
yeah,
feedback.
the Spintron, like there might be some confusion because some of the pictures that I put up are all like design stuff. The Spintron is really just measuring the separation. We put a laser tracker on the back of the valve to see if the valve's floating. That's all we're looking at. The numbers don't like the numbers of the cam don't show up on the Spintron. Only
But
whether
you
it's
could see the instability with the
yeah.
Spintron.
So your base setting on the Spintron would be done at low speed when everything is like in contact. There's no separation whatsoever. So that establishes your reference profile, right? And
But
then as you speed it up, you start to see the delay in the timing system. As things speed up, and then all the events start to trail behind because things are getting tugged on so hard, right? You could see how the graph shifts over during acceleration. So it's like it's even though you set it at a certain event timing, it might be delayed as the RPMs go up.
Okay.
I think what Jay is referring to, Dave, is two comparisons. So two, both the low RPM and high RPM uh, plots for two different camps. Something a little less aggressive, and then something very aggressive when things are getting out of control. Maybe he's looking for two examples of two cam profiles on the Spintron, and if we can plot the lift and duration of each and see how things are affected by these intensities.
I'll tell you. I mean, you don't need a dyno to do that, right? If you have the right 50 duration number, the cam that gets to the seat faster is going to have more dynamic compression. It's like one of the things that I say is like everybody's chasing leaks in their engine. Like we'll get somebody call up, oh, your throttle body leaks, and it's like a pinhole in a balloon. It like barely leaks or whatever, and they're thinking it's going to have this huge impact. The biggest leak in your engine is the camshaft, right? So
Yeah.
if I could go to 50 to 0 in an instant, I would do that, but I can't. So how long you drag out the the below 50 number, however that profile looks, you could either make it seat faster, you can make it seat slower. I see no advantages of making it seat slower because your performance gain is all in your 50 number. Like the 50 number kind of gives you the general size of lift and duration that you need. And then the below 50 numbers, how much are you bleeding off?
Do you think that we've done a good enough job explaining that you can only move these parts so fast and keep them under control? Like when you go to the previous illustration you had with the valve events, the intake valve and the exhaust valve, and how there's overlap in the middle. And during that overlap period, it's kind of a relay race. You're trying to make this gentle transition between the valve events because you can't just open and close them like a switch.
Yeah, I would say ultimately in any racing engine, it's like it's a tight fit. When you optimize everything, it's a tight fit. Like right now, like when you start off with a new engine project, you might set it up really loose, just because But then over time, what you do is you just keep tightening things up,
Yeah,
right? I mean, you can like so for example, is like piston clearances. How tight can you run it? Well, you're going to gain power until it seizes,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So same thing, piston to valve clearance is like, how tight do you want to run it? I mean, we know that, like, I mean, we're kind of getting off topic. We're talking about engine building now, but some high output pro stock engines, you'll see the logo from the piston shadowed on the head. The shit's so close, you
Sure.
know, or there's like the dot peen serial number takes out a little bit of carbon, and it's right there, right? They're trying to run it really close, right? So, um, I don't know if I answered your intensity question, um,
No, I
but let
think
me.
you got it. Like, it's it's how in how many degrees of rotation the camshaft goes from X lift to Y lift.
Right,
Right.
right. So, like, degrees is like our measurement of time. If we're to look at things in terms of the engine as the clock.
Yeah.
So, hydraulic intensity is usually from 50 to 4 thousandths, and I suspect the reason why I set it up at 4 thousandths and probably why most advertised numbers are around 4 to 6 is because those lifters start out at 0, but they blow down 2 to 5 thousandths. The hydraulic lifter, when you run it through the rotation, it bleeds pressure. It might not bleed a lot, but it will bleed between 2 and 5 thousandths of an inch just over while you're compressing the cam. The lifter is going to, it's going to pump down.
Right.
So hydraulic intensity is measured off of 4 because that's our checking point, right? With the hydraulic, we're technically at 0 the whole time, and then it just comes up. Last time we talked about it, how, like, a lot of the jerk that we're talking about, you don't see it in a solid lifter engine because it's past it's before the lash point. But hydraulic is whatever the profile, the valve train's going to see it.
And what a blessing overhead cam engines are. You start talking about moving the lifter, and I'm thinking about push rod and what happens to the push rod is just such a mess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Dave, in this illustration here, just so we don't miss it, you probably should label in this profile lift, just draw out lift and duration. And then in that number, let's just say we're talking J's cam 276 degrees of duration, what the actual 276 is. And we can probably point that out in the illustration.
I did that.
Yep.
Your checking point down here in this area.
Yeah, I think we cut you off. We were talking about Adam, and then we ended up changing screens here. But
This graph kind of shows everything.
It's actually really complete. Nice
Yeah.
job.
Here, I'll add another layer of this that happens. Let's do blue. Ignition, 15 degrees before top dead center, and then on this side, say this is our peak pressure. Let's say it's 15 ATDC peak pressure.
maybe we should talk about that too, peak pressures and the importance of peak pressures as it applies to that ignition event.
What do you want to talk about there? Peak pressure, you want it to happen somewhere between, typically they say like 10 and 18 degrees.
Meaning you defined peak pressure, peak cylinder pressure. So I'm just giving the audience the significance of peak cylinder pressure and also that ignition event because they do go hand in hand.
All right, okay, so you see the compression stroke going up. So at max piston speed, 75 degrees either direction from the top, from TDC, either way is about where your max piston speed is. Right? So the ignition begins at 30 degrees top dead center. Piston's still going up. Right? And then the flame propagates, so the maximum pressure is reached around. Okay, so we ignited it 30 degrees before this point, and then I'm just arbitrarily grabbing 15. It could be anywhere. It could be before that or after that slightly. So peak cylinder pressure is there, and then the next critical event is where do we open the exhaust valve? Right. So the power, even though the stroke is 180 degrees, the actual number of degrees the force is really pushing on it is probably only about 30 degrees. Right. So it's not like it's a full 180 degree power stroke. The pressure is high. It pushes for 30 degrees, and then the piston's running away from it. Right.
Yeah.
So you're not really making power, but if your valves are closed, so you want to open the valves to let that exhaust out, just to start blowing it down.
What we're doing now it hasn't been done, not in our industry, and we're faced with many things that even pro stock and even some of the top racing tiers aren't faced. Like our average piston speeds are greater than that of almost every tier of racing I can think of, other than maybe pro stock. Over 7,000 feet per second.
We're higher than pro stock. We're way higher than pro stock. The only faster piston speed engines are those pro mod guys when they really spin them up.